Good morning, Living as a Disciple students. We've got a lot to cover today. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen with you. And we will get started. So today we are talking about racism. This is L2D4 homework. Obviously, this is a topic that requires a lot of maturity to go into, to discuss. And I always really look forward to the discussions that we have in class over the next basically 3 class periods where we really dive into this topic and have some really good discussions about it. So let's get started. The first thing to acknowledge is that it's difficult to talk about race. Biologically, race has no impact on our nature. It has never been found that someone who is black, someone who is white, right, someone who is Hispanic, that it has never been found that there are different biological characteristics. But for years, skin color has been used to distinguish between groups. And so culturally, people have been treated differently because of their skin color. And so race has become real in people's perception. Now, the challenge to this is skin color can be many different races. So someone who's black in the United States isn't necessarily African American, right? You could have someone who immigrated from Haiti. You could have someone who immigrated from England and who is black, and they're going to have had very different cultural experiences from one another. Same thing when we say Hispanic. That could be someone who immigrated from Spain. That could be someone who's been a 3rd generation and their parents immigrated from Mexico. That could be someone who's a refugee from Guatemala, right? There are many different, so that's a challenge when we talk about race. In general, our definition for race is that it's a group defined by physical characteristics and or a common cultural background. So race has to do with physical characteristics, yes, because we have grouped people that way, but it's also a cultural background because for years, again, we've grouped people and treated people and developed certain customs among people. And finally, racism is learned. So in 1979, the United States Catholic bishops wrote a pastoral letter called Brothers and Sisters to Us. And in this letter, now think this is 15 years after the Civil Rights Act was passed in 1964. And so they're writing from a historical perspective. And first thing that they do is they condemn racism as a sin and then acknowledge it still exists despite advances. So, no longer could companies put signs in the door that said, Negroes need not apply. No longer could you have these blatant forms of racism. And so they acknowledge that these blatant forms of racism have been eliminated. But rather than eliminating racism, what happened was more of what they call a covering over instead of a change of heart. That laws can't eliminate the racism that still exists within people. And so, but because the laws had been reached, because civilly, right, African Americans had the same rights as whites, because the Voting Rights Act, all these different things were passed, it kind of led to an acceptance of the status quo, to kind of us saying, okay, we've reached the goal, we're done now. And that's the first thing that the bishops say in this letter. And let's actually read an excerpt from it. You can answer a question on this in just a second, but then we'll read an excerpt on the next page. Again, I'd like you to read this excerpt from Brothers and Sisters to Us and be ready to answer a question about it. So part 2 of Brothers and Sisters to Us. The bishops basically, and this is in 1979 and it's still true today, they acknowledge that racial and economic justice are closely tied together. And we'll discuss a little bit about why that is in class, the historical events that led to this happening. But all you have to do is look at rates of poverty, look at rates of welfare, look at all these different economic, rates of who goes to college, rates of all these different things. Who are the leaders in businesses? And you'll notice there's a discrepancy in race, right? That today, racism is much more subtle than it used to be. Now, do you have examples where it's not subtle? Absolutely. You absolutely have that. But compared to, right, the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, even the 1980s, right, today, racism is not as overt and blatant as it was. And because of that, it's harder to combat, right? It poisons our structures and it poisons our hearts. And because it's, for lack of a better term, because racism is sneakier today, it's harder to combat. Again, all of our laws, for the most part, all of our laws treat whites and blacks the same, and Hispanics and any other group. And yet, there's still inequality. So finally, the bishops say that Catholics are called to continual conversion and change of heart, and to stand with the oppressed. So next, I want to look at this USCCB pastoral letter that was actually written last year, and it's called Open Wide Our Hearts. This was just written in November, so hot off the presses, big news. First thing they do is they say, 40 years after their last letter, they say, yeah, racism still affects our culture. All you have to do is look at the news and the killing of unarmed blacks, the numbers of each race in prison, especially black and brown peoples. All you have to do is look at the fact that many groups in our society fear the police. At the same time, they say don't dehumanize the police, and that we should not violently attack the police, and that there are many who have good hearts, but the fact that so many fear the police should tell us that something is wrong. And then they say, just look at the allocation of resources. I don't know if you remember a few years back, Flint, Michigan, there was a huge water crisis where the water for years had been unsafe to drink. That was a predominantly African-American community. So what they do in this letter is, one, they call on us to acknowledge our failures, to acknowledge the ways that our country has let down people of color, to become informed. They say too many Catholics are unaware of the way that racism poisons our institutions. And they say we need to become informed. We need to become aware of it. Again, circle of social action, first step. And then to listen to the stories of people affected by this, to engage them, to have conversations about it. And these conversations can often be difficult and challenging. And those are what we're going to try to do in class. And then the other thing that they do in the letter, which is really cool, I think, is they provide a historical overview of Native American, African American, and Hispanic discrimination. They kind of give an overview of their time in this country and how these groups have been affected negatively. So, final slide. How do we combat racism? Being colorblind is not the solution. I think you sometimes hear people say this, that, oh, I'm colorblind, I treat everyone the same. But we have to recognize that race has played a huge role in our history. For the majority of our country's history, race has affected how people have lived, and it still does today. And we need to acknowledge that. We need to understand the historical context if we're going to have a fruitful discussion about racism. Right? Don't be colorblind. Talk about the real impacts race has had and still has on people's lives. We must not shy away from these difficult and sometimes awkward conversations. So, like I said, in class, we're going to not shy away. We're going to dive in. I look forward to it. As always, like, comment, and subscribe. And